Our second panel of the day will discuss the readiness of our industrial base for protracted conflict. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 turned this conversation from theoretical to practical. We developed a newfound assessment of our stockpiles and everything that actually goes into replenishment. And for the next 50 minutes, we have an expert group to discuss the extent of our readiness. The conversation is going to be moderated by Gordon Lubold, who's covered the military for 20 years. Today, he reports on the White House and national security for the Wall Street Journal. Gordon is joined by the Honorable Andrew Hunter, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, Mr. Young Bang, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, Alexis Lasselle Ross, who's former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Strategic and Acquisition Reform, and Brandon Tseng, co-founder of Shield AI. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
We're here to talk about industry and government and what they can do better to work together for national security. This is not the first time I've ever had the privilege to lead a discussion like this. Sometimes I wonder, why are we still talking about this and why are we asking the same questions? But here we are. As I don't need to tell the panel or any of you, the world is a dangerous place. There's a lot going on. So it seems like an opportune moment to talk about some of these issues. What I thought we would do is we have a great panel who were just introduced. I wanted to let each one have like a minute or two, maybe three, no more, to kind of explain to you all like how they see the world, where they sit in the context of this, and then we'll get to some questions. And I hope to have a conversation after that and ask questions and people interrupt and argue and whatever else. But we'll go down the line. So Andrew, please welcome and shoot.
All right, thanks, Gordon, and it's a pleasure to be here and be with this panel and be with a lot of friends here up on stage. So I just want to talk just a minute or two on the front end about building an acquisition system in the Department of Defense, but for my bandwidth within the Department of the Air Force, and specifically for the Air Force, that's fit for purpose for the modern day, for the modern era. And what do we? So I just want to kind of start from what is an acquisition system that is fit for purpose from our modern era look like. And what do I mean when I say modern era? I mean a time of strategic competition between nation states that are peers, that are actively engaged in an ongoing strategic competition across every dimension: economic, military, political, diplomatic, that is ongoing, active, and intense all the time. And in that environment, what the United States, what our national defense strategy tells us to do, is to deter military conflict in that environment, and if necessary, to be prepared to actually win a conflict, a high-intensity conflict with a peer competitor, if that were to become necessary. And so we need an acquisition system that is fit for purpose for that task. And so we can talk about the merits and the demerits of our defense acquisition system. It has many of both. One thing I would point out is it was in fact designed for an era similar to the one that we are currently in. It was designed for the Cold War, for an intense peer competition environment. However, it was not designed at a time when we had the pace of technological change that we have today. So that, like I said, it has merits and it has demerits. For me, and so for this acquisition system, what do we actually want? We want an acquisition system that is able to deliver capabilities, sophisticated capabilities, capable of succeeding in that environment that I talked about, to do it quickly and at scale. And all of those things, all those elements are challenging, but they're all things that we know that we can do when we organize and dedicate ourselves appropriately, with one very significant caveat that I'll get to at the end, but that I heard the last panel allude to, which is money. But so our acquisition system has to have the ability of being flexible and dynamic, based around architectures that allow us to integrate highly sophisticated military capabilities across wide ranges of time and distance around the globe. We need an industrial base that is able to provide those kind of capabilities, that has sufficient capacity for high-intensity conflict, and then has dynamic competition between existing and new competitors to drive the innovation that we need. And then, as I said, what does it really take to deliver all that? We certainly have work to do within the department. I'm going to make the case, I think it's in our discussion, that we've done a lot to show that we can perform in the fashion that I have described. But bottom line, we also need money. And that's where the lack of a budget right now is really a critical disenabler for us, and one that we very much hope is addressed relatively soon. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Andrew. Jan.
Gord, thank you for having me, and love what you said, sir. I think the Army has a similar approach. We're calling it a little bit different, but everything that you outlined, I think, resonates with me, right? So when I was in the Army, I was a benefit of what we used to call the Big Four, the Abrams, Apache, the Bradley, those type of things. And it took us, 10 years to build it, another 20 years to field it. And even though those were fielded in the 80s, we can see that our exquisite weapon systems that we've made from then, extremely effective against Russia. And so if you think about that, you hear in the news about Army and the Army modernization efforts. We are undergoing a huge modernization effort. And based on my comments, y'all might be, hey, why do you need to modernize the Army? Well, it worked extremely well in the Cold War and the Russia fight, but it's not as effective against our peer threat in China. And so when you think about the exquisite capabilities that we've developed 40 years ago, yes, they have proven the test of time, but the same doctrine, the same technology, the same equipment won't work against China. So that's why we're modernizing the Army really quickly. And underpinned by all that modernization is kind of where my specialty is, around digital transformation. And when you talk about this topic, Gordon, about the industrial base and how we're prepared, well, fortunately, Congress has given us certain authorities. The Army, as well as the Air Force and other services, have been really proactive in enabling the different acquisition pathways and enabling and using a lot of the authorities that have been granted to us. But being creative around those things, I think, help us do a couple things: get the speed of the acquisition. So, like I said, 10 years to build and 20 years to field. We've actually gotten systems from the time we've got requirements, 2 years to build and actually field. And the way that we're doing those things, we're actually using a combination of different acquisition pathways and different authorities to accelerate that. The ability to get prototypes out there faster, quicker, right? And leap ahead, and things like the whole rapid prototyping ability that we've been afforded by Congress has been critical. Now, shifting it back to the whole industrial base, we are taking a lot of lessons learned from Ukraine. The scale of our industrial base to be able to ramp up capacity, right, on the ammunition side, if you think about that, the volume of ammunition that Ukraine is using is not really what we've been accustomed for. And of course, we're supporting, and we're not going to go below our tamers, but we need to scale our industrial base capacity. And again, with the help of Congress and our OSD colleagues, as well as our sister services, we've all been supporting Ukraine, but we do need to scale that a little bit more and better. And again, we need more resources, Honorable Hunter talked about, and we need extensions of these authorities to include multi-year authorities, as well as the ability to reprogram and other things in the current year, as well as when you think about the scale, the Army has been actually investing in scaling our production and capacity in our ammo plants. But with the additional monies and authorities that were given through Ukraine, we've actually been able to accelerate that. So that's been helpful. And I would actually, again, we can talk about the traditional industrial base and supply chain, but also I would also like to focus that we also have to do the same thing on the digital side. There's a digital industrial base. There's a digital supply chain that we have to be really thinking through. And the Army and our sister services are also working that as well in parallel.
Thanks so much. Alexis.
Thanks. Thank you again for the introduction and for including me in the panel. And so as was mentioned, a former official in the Army acquisition space, but also on the Hill in the House Armed Services Committee and wrote much of the recent acquisition reforms. But these days I am a strategic planner and I help companies navigate through that acquisition system. So my perspective now on the flip side in the private sector is a little bit different. But I can appreciate everything that's been said so far and would echo it. So one of the other things that I do is I sit on the Army Science Board. And the Army Science Board is sort of like a board of advisors to the Secretary of the Army. And so I'm going to spend my 2 minutes talking about some findings that are relevant to this panel about production of ammunition and the munitions situation that we're in right now, as Young mentioned. So there's a lot of findings and a lot of recommendations. I'm just going to focus on one element of it. So the Secretary asked the Army Science Board to take a look at how you could scale and ramp up munitions production when needed. And it's not so much, this of course is at the time that the Army itself is doing quite a lot to get on top of it. So it was also with a look of how do we avoid this from happening again in the future. So as I said, a lot of findings, but what we really found when we looked at that question was kind of two things. First, this is early, this is about a year ago, so this is the early 2023. We've been about 9-10 months in to engaging with industry and trying to ramp up production, and the results were not quite as what was expected at the time. So what we found was they didn't surge initially in that early 2022 timeframe by then because they couldn't. Simply put, they didn't have the surge capacity, because what is surge? It's excess capacity above and beyond what you're funded for. And it's just not a good, strong business case to be made for sheltering that. And then number two, they wouldn't surge, and I'm speaking generally here, without orders, without money on contract, it couldn't justify expending the capital to their shareholders for something that where the government hadn't put in the contract yet. And why? And it's mostly because they've just been burned too many times. If you look at the case, over several decades, ammunition had been prioritized below many other requirements for so many decades, and at all levels. There's not a single entity to blame. Army, OSD, Congress, everyone made a lot of choices and robbed Peter to pay Paul. And so when the budget is scarce like that and the funding is going up and down and the orders are sporadic, what does industry do? They start prioritizing. They don't put in their own investment, and before you know it, they streamline. Lines are shuttered, facilities are closed, tooling atrophies, workforce departs the market, retires and whatnot. And the situation continues all the way down the supply chain. Suppliers go out of business, leading single points of failure, and emerging foreign sources of supply that are cheaper emerge, and often adversarial sources. So this is not a good picture, but it is characteristic of the defense industrial base today. This is what we've got. So, and hope, we also made a lot of recommendations too, so it's not all gloom, and hopefully we can talk about some of those things about how do we get out of this mess.
Good. Brandon.
Awesome. Excuse me. Thank you, Gordon. My name is Brandon Tseng, president and co-founder of Shield AI. I'm a former Navy SEAL. Our mission at Shield AI is to protect service members and civilians with artificially intelligent systems. In pursuit of this mission, we're building the world's best AI pilot. The easiest way to think about an AI pilot is self-driving technology for aircraft, and I'll touch on why I think that's important. But also we are one of two multi-billion-dollar defense technology companies founded in the past 20 years. Palantir and SpaceX founded over 20 years ago. Before I get into the question of is the U.S. industrial base prepared for protracted conflict, I take a step back and say, why scale the industrial base? Right? I think that's really important to understand. And it comes back to the fundamental warfare concept of mass, right? Mass is a warfare concept as old as warfare itself. For the past 4,000 years, generally speaking, if you had larger forces, you would dominate, you would crush forces that were smaller than you. So that is why, first and foremost, I think we're even talking about scaling the industrial base, because we have to be prepared to deter and, if necessary, win a conflict with large amounts of forces. To the question of, is the industrial base actually prepared for a protracted conflict? If we're talking about China, I would say the answer is no. But at the same time, I would say don't underestimate the spirit and will of the industrial base. In 1939, we were producing 2,000 airplanes that year. FDR, our president, recognized that war with Germany and perhaps Japan was going to be inevitable, asked industry to prepare for that moment, and really started, the executive branch putting their thumb on the scale as it relates to the industrial base. And so by 1944, we were producing 100,000 aircraft per year. For the entirety of the conflict, World War II, over 6 years, we produced 320,000 aircraft. Japan, Germany, and Italy produced 210,000 aircraft. And so that gives you a sense, we started to produce better aircraft towards the end of World War II. But that gives you a sense of why the industrial base is important. Unfortunately, that is not going to be the case when we think about an industrial superpower like China. Their industrial base is 10 to 1 the United States. When you think about our allies, our partners, maybe it becomes a 3 to 1 advantage for them. And so we have to think about how we employ our forces to deter and win if necessary. And it's going to be a very, very different force structure than what our military has traditionally put forward over the past 70 years. So if you have a 3 to 1 advantage, you have to say, okay, if China has a 3 to 1 advantage in terms of the global industrial might, you have to have systems that are cheaper. You have to have systems that are smarter, more intelligent, that take advantage of our software base. So what Young and Andrew have spoken about really resonates with me, but that is how you are going to deter conflict. And just to give you a really pointed example of like what this looks like in terms of the difference, if you look at our most exquisite Group 5 drone, and I won't name it, you guys can look it up, but it's a $180 million aircraft. It will be shot down in the first days of any conflict by a $1 million surface-to-air missile. And so when you look at the scoreboard, you say, great, $179 million advantage to China, minus $179 million advantage to the United States. We have to flip that cost asymmetry on its head or bring it down massively if we talk about being prepared for a protracted conflict. I actually think about deterring a conflict is first and foremost way more important, and that is why it is urgent to start building the force that is needed to deter the conflict, which looks way different than what we have today.
Awesome. Thanks. I love a bunch of that. You guys have touched on a bunch of different things. We'll try to get to it in the time we have. I think I just had, and I think I'll ask specific questions of each one of you in a minute, but I have one other question for now for all of you, which is just post-Ukraine, was Ukraine a 9/11 moment for the government and for industry? If it was, what are we seeing that's different? If it's not, why not? And I guess we'll just go down the line.
I don't know if I would characterize it as a 9/11 moment. I do think it definitely told us things that are very important about the era of strategic competition that we're in. And that most important thing I would say is peer competitors can end up in high-intensity conflict relatively easily. So, if you go back to the history of the Cold War, right, things could have gone differently than they did. But so one possible lesson, though, is when nation states understand that conflict can lead to catastrophic consequences, they seek to avoid it. What we see in the current strategic environment, I think, is that it is less stable than what we saw in the Cold War. Less stable because it's more complex. There's more actors. There's more, perhaps, arenas of competition. And that leads to a greater likelihood that intense conflict can actually be kicked off. And that nation-state leaders will gamble, potentially wrongly, that this is going to be in their interest and actually do it. So I think that is one of the biggest takeaways of what happened in Ukraine.
And just to put a finer point on it, I think I'm thinking in terms of the defense industrial base and the government wired to work together to produce more weaponry, more whatever it is that's needed, because certainly Ukraine showed us, the dearth of that ability. So anyway, so Young.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about the 9/11. In certain dimensions, I think it was, and others, I don't think it was. So if you think about in the context of what 9/11 did, for the Army at least, it changed the way that we fought. So instead of the large-scale combat operations, the Cold War type of mindset, we had to go to a COIN, counterinsurgency warfare mindset, which necessitated a different force structure, different capabilities, different force employment and strategies. 20 years later now, we have to shift again back to a more of a larger scale type of mindset, which also necessitate a change in force structure or doctrine and tactics and those type of things. So I think in that context, thinking about how we fight and how the Army has been optimized to fight in a counterinsurgency, we have to shift again. So I think in that context, yes. I think from a warfare perspective, I don't think it was a 9/11 per se. It gave us a lot of good insights. So if you look at war now with the Ukrainians fighting a larger volume, size, capability of an organization like Russia, we've seen different tactics that are more effective than we had anticipated. So their ability to be low tech and high tech, right, has been critical. And that low tech and high tech has really spurred them to be more innovative in how they fight with what they got. And so they didn't have for example, they didn't have our exquisite fire and artillery systems. But they didn't actually have to get over all the technical debt that we have to evolve it. And so they were able, working with us, to innovate something that's a lightweight ability to get at the targeting. They were able to crowdsource a lot of information from open source and public available information, especially around battle damage, to really get at and accelerate the way that they've been fighting. And so if you think about this whole notion of innovation, they were able to do it with a combination of low tech and high tech. And bringing back to Brandon's comment about China, China's got 1.4 billion people. They got volume on us, just across the board, from personnel, from aircraft, from all those different type of things. And for us, if we're going to go back to a large-scale conflict, Cold War era, doctrine versus doctrine, we're just outnumbered. And so we do have to think differently. We have to think about how do we innovate, not just technology, and again, I am a tech person, but technology is not innovations. It's the applications of the technology to radically transform the way that we fight, or the way that we look at a problem, or the way that Ukraine used the low tech and high tech to innovate. I think that's what we have to do. And again, I think that applies to warfare, but also I think we also have to take a lesson learned on the industrial base as well, right? It has taken us a long time to scale to where we are now. When we started Ukraine, we had 12,000 155 rounds that were produced every month. We're at 36 now, and by the end of this fiscal year, we'll be at 80,000, and the end of this 25 calendar year, we'll be at 100,000. That's great, but that's just for 155s.
Right.
And when you think about what Brandon's comment about China and their industrial base and their companies that they have, well, China is still a communist company. They could just take over any company they want like that, right? Look at some of, some of the companies that have already co-opted already to do that. They could do that at will. We don't necessarily want to do that, but the volume of what they have is a lot bigger, and we do have a pretty good industrial base that looks like this kind of pyramid with the larges and the subs and second, third tiers. But to his comment, a lot of our allies' industrial base looks like this. And so I would question that if we actually worked with all of our partners, that it would be a 3-to-1 advantage. I would probably say it's from 10-to-1 less, but not close to a 3-to-1 advantage. And I think we do have to look at that more as we scale our own industrial base. I think we have to do it with our allies and partners strategically to scale theirs and our own industrial base, because the China fight, I know everyone thinks the China fight in the Indo-PACOM is a air or naval fight, but if you're a student of history, going to West Point, I study history and tactics, it was an island hopping campaign. And yes, there were big battles like Midway and those type of things, but the tyranny of the distance, the lack of interior lines, the lack of magazine depth, meaning how are we going to resupply our Army units, our Marine units, our SOF units that literally will take over 24 hours to fly from here to Australia. How do we resupply that? We're going to have to look at our allied partners and their help in their industrial base as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Alexis, what have we learned or not learned since February 2022?
Yeah, I think that's exactly how I was going to answer the question, is Ukraine created something here, a learning moment, right?
It seems like it should have.
It has. I think it was a big aha moment. I think we all in the defense industrial base are realize we're seeing ourselves better. I think that the department is seeing itself better and understanding a little bit more about the kinds of buying behaviors that we've utilized for so many decades, and how it's just you have what you provide, right? And so I keep saying the Department of Defense and government did not provide enough consistent demand signal to have the kind of industrial base that it wants today. They anticipated it would surge, they took risk in the budget, and it did not surge. And so there's a lot of reasons, and I think that is the most important thing that Ukraine has done, is it showed us where our weaknesses are. And also, to Young's point, I think we've learned in the last couple of years, especially post-COVID, that our supply chains and industrial base we're not going to be able to do this alone. We are going to have to rely on allies and partners. Reshoring, friendshoring, it's going to have to be a combination.
Got it. Brandon, what do you think?
Yeah. I actually think first I take a step back and say, what did China and Russia and Iran learn by watching us fight from 2001 to 2020? And that dovetails into what we're now seeing in Ukraine. And so what did they observe during that fight? When we were fighting the global war on terror. Overarching, the United States relies heavily on air superiority. That is what enables our ground forces to maneuver like no other force in the world. And so you say, okay, well, what are the tenets of their air superiority that they have learned to fight with from 2001 to 2020? That close relationship between ground maneuver forces and air combat forces. First, all right, they started to use drones. The United States started to use drones from 2001 to 2020, became better at it than any country in the world. What do those drones rely on? GPS and communications. So if I want to stop the United States from using drones, let me start jamming GPS and communications. Take away the Achilles heel of drones, of all legacy drones. The second thing was, okay, well, now I've taken away their drones. How do I take away their bombers, their fighters, their close air support? I'm going to have to proliferate surface-to-air missiles. Let me build integrated air defense systems with radar detection, with missiles that can actually go farther than the attack range of our missiles, of our aircraft that they can see. And by that, I can then take away the United States' air superiority, which, oh, by the way, is our most conventional strategic deterrent. It's why we have 11 aircraft carriers. It's why we've invested so much into air power. It is what enables us to deter conflict. And I look at what they have done, China, Russia, Iran, they have taken it away. So that leads us to what we see in the Ukraine now and what we're observing. I don't think about it as a 9/11 moment, but I look at it's very obvious now, armchair quarterbacking, where you say, okay, air superiority, they've taken it away. How can we regain it, right? Jamming GPS, jamming drones, reports last year, 10,000 drones a month. I would say Russia started to roll that out in Q4 of 22, and it really has now sunk into the department's priority list of the importance of operating without GPS and without communications, which, oh, by the way, it requires a software, hardware solution to actually do that. And then seeing surface-to-air missiles, right? In the first days of the war, everybody was seeing Russian helicopters get shot down. We were seeing fighter jets get shot down. And if you look at the skies now over Ukraine, there's not any exquisite asset being used because it is too dangerous, it's too expensive to fly those aircraft. And so that, to me, are the big learning and observation that the United States can take is how we're seeing it real time now, the capabilities that Russia and China and Iran are developing to counter our strategic deterrent. And so it's our turn to say, all right, how do we now overcome this? How do we reestablish air superiority so that we can maneuver ground forces and deter conflict if necessary?
Fair. A bunch of things in all your answers, but I wanted to look at one example of what would seem to me to be the Pentagon's answer to some of these issues in terms of getting innovation, getting stuff into the warfighters' hands quicker, is Replicator program, which is a DoD program, I understand. The services are going to assume some ownership of it at some point. Not sure where they are on that. But I wondered, 5 months into the announcement of Replicator by Kath Hicks, what has been accomplished in it's one more question for the entire group, and then we'll get to some other ones. But what's been accomplished, what hasn't been accomplished? It's not a program of record, but people like to talk about it as a process. But what does that mean, and can it be applied elsewhere? So just a bunch of smattering of things. We don't have to go always in order. Young, how about, you want to jump?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. I think the Army has been working a lot on a lot of drone efforts, some programs, some not. We've been working with the SOF community on different things that are out there, and at a high level, what we've done, and so has the other services, right? The Air Force has their own drone programs as well. I think what this does is that the DoD and the DepSec has really put on a focus to help accelerate some of the efforts that we have all in the services. And coupled with that effort, as well as support from Congress, I think we could potentially accelerate and hopefully get some resourcing to be able to meet those demands. So I do agree, I think it's a process and an ability to accelerate the efforts that the services are doing.
I think some people in the audience might be saying process. Where's the action? Alexis, what do you make of that question?
I actually think there's a lot been talked about the fact that there isn't any funding behind it, or there wasn't initially.
Sorry, say again?
There has been some talk about how there's not funding behind it.
Correct.
And I think you mentioned a second ago it's not an official program of record. I think I still applaud the Department of Defense for doing it. I think that that's still a step in the right direction. I think that when you say process, it sounds like a bad word.
It sounds awful.
But an acquisition process is important, and I think what they're attempting to do is sort of jumpstart that process and move things faster and in a more deliberate fashion. And sometimes it takes leadership at the highest levels in order to get that kind of stuff done. So I think that in that sense, I would not say process is a bad word in this case. I think I applaud them for trying to muster and galvanize the system.
Andrew, any sense of what's been accomplished in 5 months on that program? And I know you're not here to defend the program or whatever, but you might have some insights, I guess.
Yeah, well, so Department of the Air Force, we're all in on the Replicator initiative.
Good answer.
Actively engaged and working our piece of it. There's a lot, probably I wouldn't be in a position to say at this point in time, right, because others will announce it when they are ready to announce it. But having said that, one thing I want to throw on the table, and I alluded to it in my first comments, but I didn't really explicate it, which is the nature of the kind of conflict that we anticipate is one that requires really sophisticated integration of capabilities across time, space, and domains, right? Multi-domain operations, a number of terms that have been used to describe it, but it's highly challenging. It is extremely countercultural to the way that all of the U.S. services have operated throughout their history, and that is not to dismiss the fact that the U.S. is probably the most joint military in the world, and yet even still, it is very hard to do highly integrated joint operations across domains. And I think one of the facets of Replicator that I find really appealing and that I think is really significant is that it is starting out intentionally as a multi-domain integrated approach to leveraging the small, many, quick approach across multiple domains. So to me, that is a really significant thing, and I think we have made progress in the timeline since Replicator was announced today, and actually turning that into something that we can do, and that ultimately then supporting capabilities that we can deliver to the warfighter.
Got it. Brandon, from where you sit, what do you make of the program and its success or failure so far?
Yeah, I'm very excited about Replicator. To me, it's a signal from the senior level of defense to say, hey, we need to rethink about the way that we're fighting. And rethink about the way that we are structuring our forces. So I hope that message is proliferated across all of the acquisition department, right? People like to focus on Replicator, because it's got the media attention of it, but it's got to be proliferated throughout the entire department in terms of that concept of moving quickly, building lots of stuff, building lots of smart stuff to get after our problems. I also think that the DoD has done like a really good job on a number of different efforts that people just don't track. We have sent thousands of munitions, thousands of drones over to Ukraine, and it just doesn't get the media headline. But that industrial base is beginning to turn the crank. I get excited about things like Replicator because you start to turn the crank faster and faster and faster, which is needed when we talk about deterring a conflict with China. So very excited about it. It's going to supercharge what has already been happening in the Defense Department that a lot of people might not have visibility into.
Got it. Let me ask a two-part question, one to the government guys and one to our other two. Just from where obviously in the context of everything that we're talking about, Andrew, what's the one thing that you point to that you feel has been an action item that you feel like has succeeded so far inside the Air Force in your world?
I would say the biggest thing is the ability to put together industry teams, broad-based, traditional, non-traditional, in contractual arrangements and structures that are underpinned, this is a slightly complicated answer, so my apologies, underpinned by sophisticated government and industry negotiated and developed architectures that then allow us to field capability rapidly at scale, right? To do the thing that I described in my opening remarks. So, we talk about fast, right? Fast requires many things. One of the things it requires, I think, if you're going to do it successfully and repeatedly, is an underpinning that I call an architecture, right? That this is how things fit together, that I can then get different people in different parts of industry building different things, and when it all comes together, it works. And that, I think, when I came into this job, I saw that as an imperative. What I discovered, to my pleasant surprise when I arrived, is a very substantial foundation for that had already been laid, and many kudos to my predecessors for leading that effort, and many people on my team today who did that and are continuing to do it. And that, to me, is the most significant thing.
Good. A lot of times these kinds of questions, this topic lends itself to wonky answers, and I understand, but I'm going to give you a little credit for a wonky answer there. But that's good. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, can I just, sorry. So
sure.
Your critique is correct, but to just put a pointed, right, so that is what our collaborative combat aircraft program is. Okay. It is a diverse set of industry partners that we are working with. It is underpinned by a government reference architecture that enables how the elements fit together and how the autonomy associated with that system will work. And then it is moving fast and at scale. Okay, fair.
Young, that same question for you, and then also just because you're an Army guy, I'm curious, when Army Futures Command was created, I think there's a lot of concern about Army acquisition getting in the way of innovation. So first, what's your success story? Second, is Army acquisition any less in the way than it was a few years ago when AFC was created, or 5 years ago?
Yeah, so I'd say for us, I alluded to it, and it might also answer some of your second question, right? When I talked about it earlier, about our ability to innovate and create prototypes and then field something in 2 years from the time that we get a requirement, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, literally. And when you think about the speed of the technology that's out there.
2 years to compress it to 2 years from Mark Milley's 9-year pistol that he complained about and all that. So now it's down to 2 years.
Yeah, so that should show you.
Doesn't need to be faster though.
It is faster, right? Because we have actually fielded it, right, to our soldiers, and our capabilities to our soldiers really where we're focused. AFC has been an amazing partner with us to get that done, right? Whether it's them working with us to really accelerate the requirements process or get to a CNS, so it's not literally a book of a requirement.
Right.
That really, if you think about the acquisition lifecycle, requirements is a big part of that. And we've been partnering together with them. We've been partnering with them on experimentations and proof of concepts and prototypes to get things out faster. And also in the same context from a digital transformation, we've been working with the testing community, right? So the whole notion of how we used to do things from a waterfall process, we got to get everything literally built to do all of our series of testing to include operational tests, literally took forever. And so when you think about how we've compressed the time that you talked about from an acquisition, right? That should really highlight that, but again, we've actually now shifted how we've actually brought the requirements community, right, from the left side and the testing community with us together. And if you think about that, that's kind of modern day Scrum. You bring your stakeholders, your requirements, your users in with you as you're developing, and your testers, and you're iterating faster and faster and faster. And that's literally how we've gotten the compressed and accelerated speed of getting our capabilities. And again, I think that just highlights how we've been working together across the enterprise to address the problems that you're talking about.
Brandon, give us an update on your view on requirements and how much they tend to be seen as a hindrance to getting innovation in the door and out to the warfighter.
I was going to answer the other question.
Well, no, I have that question for you still, but when he talked about requirements.
I'm a big proponent of acquisition reform, but at the same time, right, I operate and run a business and I have to live in terms of like, what is the here and now? And it is such a big, ugly beast that is really, really hard to tackle. And for those in the DoD who want to tackle acquisition reform, they have my full-throated support. It needs to happen. If I could snap my fingers, right? The challenge with the requirements today is all funding is generated from the requirements process, right? There's an old adage, Henry Ford said, if I asked the people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? It's the entrepreneur's job, the business's job to generate the requirements. It's the department's job to tell me about your problems. Let me come up with the solutions for your problems. And so when I think about requirements, I think about transitioning from a requirements-based acquisition system where all the funding is generated from requirements to a problem-based acquisition system where you tell me about your problems, the entrepreneurs go out, the companies go out and figure out how to solve it. I've worked with a number of the primes who say we're not gonna lift a finger until we get the requirements. The other funny thing about requirements, right? If I, as a Navy SEAL, when I was operating in Afghanistan, if there was the enemy, Taliban or Al Qaeda on a mountainside, I'd say, I could go to my team, I'd say, what's the problem? They'd all say, well, 1,000 meters away, we've got enemy Taliban maneuvering on our position. If I were to say, all right, what's the solution, right? You'd get 100 different, you'd get a lot of different responses, all valid. But that's when you think about the requirements, you have a bunch of people trying to stack hands on a solution where it's like, no, we all know the problem. Let's just figure out one person needs to make the call. We can maneuver on that position. That's the solution. So it's easy for people to stack hands on the problem. You don't want a lot of people stacking, saying, okay, well, what are the requirements that are going to solve this problem? Leave that up to the companies. So that's how I think about it.
I felt like you had a good answer on the other thing, so I want to let you have it, and then
I was just the wins that the department puts up a lot of wins, right? And I just want to be super clear. And you asked for
a lot of.
What's that?
They put up a lot of
wins.
Wins. Yeah.
And I wrote down three. To Andrew's point, the Air Force, great credit to them. I think they have done. They've taken a little bit of risk and they have structured a program where you talk about, and can't talk about the program, but the acquisition of platform, the acquisition of software or autonomy. And when you think about, when a software update is 2 years behind schedule, $11 billion for a software update, you ask yourself, there's got to be a better way to do this. And I think the Air Force has done that, and I applaud them to it. The other things that I see, the Navy and Marine Corps, right? There's a lot of creative people who try to work around the acquisition system because of its challenges, and there are lots of wins throughout that system where they say, you know what? program office is telling me this is going to take way too long. We want this capability. We're just going to use operation maintenance funding and do a contractor-owned, contractor-operated model
SOCOM did a lot of that.
to get it out in the field. SOCOM does that too. One of our great successes working with SOCOM and DIU, it was actually just hand in hand with the warfighters doing RDT&E. The program office is working it on the backside, but that had led to amazing capability that has saved service members, capability that is used by our allies in Israel to rescue hostages on October 7th. Just really amazing stuff that happened between a partnership between Shield AI, SOCOM, DIU. So you see a lot of these wins all the time. I think a lot of people beat the department up. The thing that I think about it's that companies want, and perhaps there is a lot of validity to it. It's like the point of improvement is just the sense of urgency, the need to move really, really, really fast.
Got it. Alexis, I would say what's the single biggest failure thus far? Or if you have a win answer, you can give that too, but I feel like you might have a view.
Actually, I thought you were going to ask me, after a spirited discussion of acquisition and reform, I thought you were going to ask the acquisition reformer if we need more reform.
You're welcome to jump in on that as well. I don't know.
We don't have enough time for all that.
Yeah, we have two. Single biggest failure, do you think?
I think it still remains the big elephant in the room, and that's how hard it is to do business with the department. It's not changing. It's hard to get after, and it has a lot to do with the economic features of the market. It's a monopsony, so it's very few buyers, one with an outsized influence. We've got very erratic buying patterns, very military unique requirements that come with low volumes. And often when they do buy something, there's a lot of space and time in between those things. So think about a platform, how long it takes before it gets upgraded. So you're driving unsuccessful bidders from the market, And besides just that, the market dynamics, then you get into budgetary implications. You have costs that are, or you have budgets that are always in jeopardy, will the government shut down, will there be a year-long CR? You have all of those considerations. And at the tactical level, programmatic funding is always in jeopardy as well. And when those things get cut, then you have, smaller volumes and that drive down production efficiencies. And then even just to offer the budget stuff back into the process and the regulations, it's very onerous, hard to understand and navigate. So, and for all that, for all your trouble, you get lower net margins. And so, the A&D said the aerospace and defense sector is got, lower comparable margins than other related, also regulated industries. And so, with those kinds of complexities, it's really hard to attract business in, and it's hard to retain the ones that we have. And if the department wants to try to maintain and sustain the industrial base, we're going to have to let entrepreneurial companies flourish. And the data is not good. In the last about 5 years, 17,000 companies have left the defense industrial base. So obviously a lot more work needs to be done.
But the Pentagon just released a new strategy for this, correct?
It did,
and
yeah.
We were talking backstage. You had a couple of thoughts. We have only a couple of seconds or whatever, but
there's been a lot of work. I'll try to make it fast. There's been a lot of work to get after the industrial base in the last, 4, 5, 6 years. A lot of executive orders that have researched it and examined it. Now we have the study. This is all good government work toward improvement. And so I applaud the department for doing it. It reads really well. There's a lot of good ideas in there. It's quite aspirational in the sense that there is, anything anyone could think of to try to fix the industrial base is in there, right? So, but when everything is a priority, nothing's a priority. So I'd like to see a little bit more specificity, and it is quite vague. Lots riding on the implementation plan, but unfortunately, I'm told that will be unclassified, and so.
Right. What's the concern about it being classified? I mean, I assume we can.
Well, from my standpoint, I think one of the things people say is hard to do business with the government is that the overclassification. How do you work with your partners and communicate when you don't have, you're not able to do that? I think it's this kind of a document, in its nature, is public policy meant to galvanize and improve industry, labor, workforce. It's going to be talking about congressional action. I don't think it needs to be classified.
Fair.
Can I make a pitch, though?
Yeah, please.
For why companies should work with the government? So
Make it just quick because we're red in the
I'll
red.
do it quick.
Sunshine's,
Not going to dispute many of the challenges that Alexis articulated. However, if you believe in the mission, this is the place where it happens. It doesn't happen anywhere else. You get working with the defense, you get a strategic partner who's in it for the long term, who can bring to the table its own expertise, its own technology development efforts that it does internally, and partner with industry. And we will help pay for R&D, which your commercial customers don't do, other customers don't do, only the government does that. So, and the cash flow actually is pretty attractive. So there are reasons why it's hard to work with the government. I would argue there are many compelling reasons to work for the government, and we very much want you, those of you who are in industry, to do that.
It is a large market, and the government always pays its bills.
Great way to close. Please join me in thanking our big brain panelists here. Thanks so much for talking.